no big fish. You enjoying the weather?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I am. I have been. Gotten 2 days out of school this week, so snow days are just as fun with your teacher as they are when you're student. Maybe more so.
Yeah. Well,
So-
Julie said about the same thing. He said, what to do with all of this free, just wonderful time that I have now.
I love my students. But there's something special about snow day. So,
I'm sure, I'm glad you enjoy the weather, our cows do not.
no, I texted you about, you guys have to work harder when the rest of us are sitting at home and you're working harder. It seems
Just a little bit
right.
colder, I mean,
Colder and muddier and more work and
well,
cold water.
we'll take it when we can,
It is good for the crops.
That it is, yes.
All right, well, enough chit chat. Where shall we start?
Let's just start at the beginning of John 19, and then we'll just go at a faster clip, because we'll start at the beginning again.
Excuse me. Okay, so we did look at the first paragraph, I guess, or whatever section of John 19 last week. We talked about it a little bit, but we'll just pick up that again and kind of review and then look at, and then go from there. So in John chapter 18, we had Jesus and the apostles in the garden, and they were approached by Judas and the cohort of Roman soldiers, and Jesus was arrested and then taken to a mockery of a trial, and Pilate asked, what is truth? And Jesus did not respond in this account when Pilate asked him that. So we're going to see more of that, I think, of Jesus not replying as he is taken to further down the road here. So John chapter 19. All right, that was a kind of a review. John chapter 19, verses 1 through 7. Pilate then took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. Put a purple robe on him, and they began to come up to him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And to give him slaps in the face. Pilate came out again and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you so that you may know that I find no guilt in him." Jesus then came out wearing a crown of thorns and a purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." So when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify, crucify." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself out to be the Son of God."
So I think we talked about this already last week, very briefly. It's just, I think that Pilate was, as it even continues on, Pilate is trying to make it the simplest, the easiest solution possible, pacify the crowds, but also not get into hot water himself. Because as we'll see, he has a pressure point. There's a point in time where he will say, "Okay, fine, I'll give you what you want as long as you don't start bad-mouthing my reputation before the emperor is kind of where we'll get here." To the end, but at this point he scourged him, kind of. And again, on one hand, you could view this as his attempt to pacify the crowd. Will this work? Are you satisfied now? Oh, are you not satisfied now? Are you satisfied now? And he comes out, and later he will say, he says, "Behold the man," in verse 5, kind of saying, "Look what I've done. Look, is this enough punishment for Jesus for you? He's innocent, but is this enough?" On the other hand, some people. You can also view this as just a softening up for the crucifixion. He knows that he's going to crucify Jesus. I've read is one point of view that he knows he's going to crucify Jesus, and he just wants to scourge him to. It's the preparation for his crucifixion kind of a thing. So there's a couple different ways of looking at it here. I put that on there, but again, the next point, a lot of this is just trying to engage with the text. It's a little bit of going outside of what Scripture is specifically saying here. But verse 6, Pilate says, take him and crucify him yourselves. But they had already talked about how they can't that's the wrong word, but they can't mete out the justice of capital punishment. The Jews are unable to kill Jesus. And crucifixion is something that had to be done by the Romans, by the Roman people. And so, again, but the phrasing is similar to when Pilate eventually hands them over in verse 16. And so this, again, it could be a little bit of a dig on Pilate, just trying to say, well, go ahead and just crucify him then. Oh, wait, you don't have the authority, you don't have the power to do that. Only I can sentence him to crucifixion. But on the other hand, it might be him giving them permission to be handed over. And so, again, there's a couple different ways of looking at it. We talked a little bit about that last week. But the main point of the text here as he's going on is that the Jews still want him to be crucified. And the Jews, in verse 7, they give the offense. They give the reason why Jesus needs to be crucified, because he claims to be the Son of God. We talked about that last week, how in chapter 10, that the Son of God makes himself equal to God, and therefore that is blasphemy, which determines that he must die, determines that he must be stoned, according to the old law. But they can't do that. They're not allowed to do that. That was one of the reasons why the whole high priest issue was all up in the air, because Annas and Caiaphas, Annas had someone stoned, and he wasn't supposed to do that. And so the Romans kind of disavowed him and put in a new guy. And so, again, they're not supposed to, and so they're looking for another way to kill Jesus. And crucifixion seems to be the easiest and best way. So the crowd will continue to push for that. Obviously, we know that Jesus is crucified, but the crowd, the mob, specifically at this point in time, the Jews are the ones that are calling for his death. As we get to the end, though, in John 19, you will see that this is not just the Jews killed Jesus. The Jews and Gentiles. Again, we want to talk about how the gospel is universal to all. The death of Jesus wasn't just because of the Jews. It was because of the Gentiles, too. And so we're equally to blame. We're equally in the fire, under inspection. Where no one has. Well, we actually got to kill Jesus. Peter will preach to Jews at the day of Pentecost and say, "Hey, you guys killed him," but it was a joint effort. And in the old Passion of the Christ movie of driving the nail into his hand, it was the producer himself. It's like, that's the same feel. We are the ones that crucified Jesus. It wasn't them, it wasn't the Jews, it wasn't these other people, it wasn't the Romans, it was us. And Paul will state that many different times throughout his writings, that it was, you crucify again Jesus when we continue to fall away in sin, when we follow that blatantly. And Jesus died for our transgressions. So that's this first little section that he's still, with Pilate and the mob, go back and forth on what's going to happen.
That's good, and I like that, the point of Pilate trying to appease last week we talked about appeasing the mob, appeasing the evildoers, and trying to draw as close to what they want without actually giving them what they want, as though that will make them happy. And I think we've seen that in our own culture today, as we, see things moving so quickly down particular paths with the way things are going socially and culturally in our nation today. It's like, we can remain silent. How did it get to the point in Germany where they killed people, where they sent people to concentration camps? Because it happened quickly. But it's because people were willing to give in to that first step, and then once you give in that first step, it just keeps going. And I think we've seen that in our own culture today. Pilate was trying that, takes a step and another step and another step, and finally ends up with Jesus dead, which is what the crowd wanted to do. Our next section there, verses 8 through 12, it says, therefore when Pilate heard the statement, he was even more afraid, and he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You do not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you, and I have authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. For this reason he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." As a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him, But the Jews cried out, saying, If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar.
So we could briefly go through this section again. I think we talked maybe a little bit, maybe not, I don't know. But so essentially, we've been talking about, I know it was like at least a month ago, but in John, I believe it's John 17 and in John 18, Jesus will mention that his hour has come. This is John 17, verse 1. Jesus spoke these things, looked at his eyes to heaven. He said, Father, the hour has come. And he'll say in John 18 that my hour has come. This cup that my Father has prepared, shall I not drink it? And so the theme throughout chapter 19 is who has the authority? Who has the power? What is going on in this situation? Is Jesus a victim of a false trial? Is he a victim of this, false trials is a good way of putting it. Is he the victim in this case? I mean, obviously, yes. But he's also the one that has the utmost authority to say this should happen or this should not happen. We had the song, he could have called 10,000 angels, but he could have done a number of things throughout this entire process to stop the process. And so, again, who has the authority, who has the power? It's ultimately Jesus. Jesus will say that I lay my life down. I have the authority to do that. It's the same word there. I have the authority to lay my life down and to take it up again. And so Jesus is the one that will ultimately lead to his own death. It's not Pilate, it's not even the crowd, it is Jesus willingly walking into the circumstance that does that.
Justin.
Yes.
And he also says, later on, in the other books too, about he gave up his spirit. They didn't take it. He gave up. He gave it up.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
He had control. You're right.
Well, that's a wonderful point, man. I wish I could have made that. That is a great thought. Jesus is the one in control, and even when we get there, the one of the things about the death of Jesus that is, I'll just say this point as of right now. I'll just go to my slide on this one and read it. The slide there that says, where'd it go? It's a good ways down there. Anyways, Jesus' death is an unnatural occurrence. It was not natural for Jesus to die. Romans 3:23 says the wages of sin is death. Jesus had committed no sin. Yes, Jesus, without taking on the sin at the cross, would have not died. And obviously, he wins over death. And so when death is knocking at the door, when death is coming for Jesus, it has no power over him. It has no authority. It cannot say, Jesus, you belong. Well, again, the personifying death. But the idea is, Jesus has the authority over death. In order to die, Jesus has to allow death to take him. Jesus has to give death the power, give him the power, submit essentially to the power of death, and he will, by doing that, conquer death. But it's an unnatural occurrence. It's not something that should have happened because he knew no sin. But as Paul will say, him who knew no sin became sin, took on our sin on our behalf. And so Jesus' death, while again, the wrath of God was being poured out on him, he was taking on our sin. He had not yet himself had ever sinned. And so his death is an unnatural occurrence. The only reason it happens is because he takes on our sin and he allows it to happen. And again, Jesus says, as we just referenced, that I have the authority to lay down my life. I take my life and I lay it down. It is in my hands. It is not being taken from me. It is something that I am willfully giving. And so, again, the last thing that I had up there on the screen of Pilate's trigger, if you will, is the Jews finally find the one thing that Pilate, let's put it this way, the thing that Pilate will trade for murdering an innocent man is his reputation, is his relationship with Caesar, is his position, is his authority, his power at this time. Again, from extra biblical records, we know that Pilate was there, and he has a rocky relationship with Caesar to begin with, and with the people, and there's lots of things going on there. And the ruler of the nation of Israel, at that land mass is traded hands and is jumping around, and even in Acts, you have two different rulers of a portion of the land, Felix and Festus, and there are different points in time. The leader, the ruler over this region of Israel changes so often. If you look into histories, again, it's all extra biblical evidence, but in history, the powers that be are flipping back and forth all of the time. And so Pilate is in a really tough place. And again, at this point in this time, he is trying to keep the peace. He is trying to keep himself out of hot water, keep himself out of being the target of all of this. Because again, if he doesn't crucify Jesus and the mob destroys the town, that's on his hands. If he does crucify Jesus and all of a sudden all the people, the Jews that said Hosanna to the king on Sunday are now saying, why did you kill Jesus? He's got another problem. And so he's trying to stay out of the hot water. But someone's saying, oh, you're no friend of Caesar. Your reputation with Caesar is at stake here. Pilate is now willing. And again, it's I think as Jason had said last week, it's kind of like that Psalm 1 metaphor of the one who just, sits in the way of sinners and stands, I think it's sits in the seat of sinners, stands in the way. Anyway, it's been a while since I've read that. But the idea there is you just slowly creep toward sin. You just slowly creep toward it. And as soon as you find it, there it is.
I'd like to throw a little sideways thing in here. I think Pilate was afraid.
It says he was.
And it says in verse 8 that he was even more afraid. Well, what was he even more afraid of? If you go back to Matthew 27, verse 19, his wife sent him a message saying, leave this righteous man alone because I'm being tormented at night. So his wife has already told him, you need to get out of this situation. So he's trying to get out of this situation by doing all these things up to the point of actually killing Jesus. And then you're correct. His trigger was, he's more afraid of Caesar than he was of those other things. And he's afraid during this time. He's doing everything he can to get out of it because his wife had already told him, and he knows he can't find anything wrong with this guy. And then he hears that they think he's the king, he's the son of God. He's even more afraid. But then they go, are you more afraid of that or Caesar? And Caesar trips it.
I think that's well said. I think he is, he's trying to straddle the fence, and he's got, it's almost like he's got 3 or 4 fences he's trying to straddle at once. He's on a corner post between a couple of corrals, and he's trying not to fall into any of them. But there's one way to be that seems as purely righteous, which would be to free the innocent man, but then that makes the Jews awful mad, which in turn starts a riot, which in turn makes Caesar very mad, which puts his life on the line. So, he's trying to appease the Jews. He's trying, I think to some degree, seems to be worried about doing the right thing, because he does, how many times has he said this man's not guilty? He's trying to preserve the integrity of the legal system, because if we go around and we just start lopping the heads off of the innocent people just because it's expedient and it's easy to do, that doesn't keep the peace for very long. You're going to have to start lopping off a lot of heads. And so, Pilate's in a tough place, not to defend his actions, but he is in a difficult spot. And at least there are some indications along the way that he tries to do the right thing.
One of the real key methods that Rome did to maintain all these satellite areas they had with so few military presence was they would come in, but they would not dictate or change their cultures any more than necessary. They would let them keep their cultures.
Yeah.
They keep that social glue intact. And this was getting ready to just totally dissolve on it right in front of him. And it was going to be on him.
Yeah. And they have kind of drawn that line in the sand when the Jews are saying, we have a law. On the one hand, they're saying, our king is Caesar. But on the other hand, they're saying, we have a law that says this man dies. And we're going to push this and make sure that our law is upheld, even though if you tell us that it's in Caesar's best interest for this man to live, we're gonna disagree with you. And so, so he is trying to straddle that fence or balance that, do that balancing act between what the Jewish law says, which the Romans don't care, but on the one hand, but on the other hand, we want to keep the Jews happy. And so we're gonna let them have their law, which is kind of where they're pushing the limits here. Great.
You know, and we touched on this a little bit last week, but I think Jesus actually helps him in a way because he's going to a cross. He
Yeah.
wants to fulfill
Yeah,
his mission. And so he gives him an answer when it comes to authority and who's to blame for all of this. He said, the one who brings me before you is of greater sin
yeah,
than your situation. And so,
yeah.
and even after that, he kept trying to find ways to free him. But I think Jesus was trying to give him an out a little bit,
Yeah.
saying that you're not to blame as much as these people that are coming.
This isn't really your decision, Pilate.
Yeah.
That's what he's saying. This is, you know.
And the irony of all of this, if history that's recorded by Josephus and others is true, is that he gets recalled to Rome for being too harsh on the Samaritans in a revolt,
Yeah.
and then disappears. You know,
Yeah.
it's uncertain where he was killed or forced to commit suicide,
Yeah.
but he did get in trouble with Caesar, and if history that's recorded is true, for just trying to handle this kind of, uprising.
Well, Jesus too was, when later on, whenever he was asked questions, he wouldn't say anything, so that, I think that tipped the scales too, you know.
Yeah.
He wouldn't put up a defense, you know, and say, well, this and this and this and this, because he just was silent and then let it run its course. Let Pilate
Yeah.
be tipped, you know, be persuaded by that.
And we talked about that some last week. It seems like, Jesus one of the reasons I think that Jesus doesn't speak is because Jesus could have defended himself and proved himself to be innocent, which would have necessitated Pilate releasing him. That wasn't Jesus' goal. And you think about Jesus, what the prophet says that like a lamb before the shears, a lamb led to the slaughter is dumb, he would not open his mouth. Well, how many lamb chops would there be at the butcher shop if the lamb could speak to the butcher before he did his job? If the lamb could open his mouth and speak and give a defense of what's about to happen, I think we'd have less lambs being slaughtered. And so Jesus fulfills that role by not defending himself even though he could.
I think it shows his complete submission
For sure.
to God's
Yeah.
will.
Jesus
He submitted.
is dedicated to his mission above all, and so speaking in his own defense does not serve that mission. So it would hinder that mission. And then just in reference to your first point there about authority's hour to come, at the beginning of John, Jesus at the beginning of John 13:1 makes that first declaration, or John makes that first declaration at the beginning of the supper. 13:1, the feast of the Passover, Jesus knowing that his hour had come, that he should depart out of the world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And I think that's where that shift happens. If you go back to the 12, it doesn't. There are other times when it said his hour had not yet come, but I think the last time that we see a hint of that is in 12:36, after Jesus, in that section, Jesus foretold his death. In verse 36, he tells the people, "When you have the light, believe in the light, in order that you may become sons of the light." These things Jesus spoke, and he departed and hid himself from them. And that's typically what he does when the crowd is ready to take him and stone him, or take him and arrest him. He disappears because his hour had not yet come. And I think there's an indication there that this may be the final time that Jesus disappears from the crowd, because it's not quite time yet. That time is not yet for another day or two. So there's that transition between chapter 12 and 13 there where that takes place. Okay, good thoughts. All right, next section, 13 through 15. Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." So they cried out, "Away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" Chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar."
So this will be, obviously, in chapter 9, or verse 19, they have this written above the cross there. And that's where I think I was trying to put that, this point, the first one up there, that Jesus, the crime that eventually, again, it's verse 19, the crime that that Pilate will put on the cross, essentially, the whole part of the cross was kind of a gruesome parade, gruesome procession of here's the enemies of Rome. Look at them. This is what they're getting punishment for. Don't do the same thing, or you might, be crucified as well. And if you think about it, the thieves and the murderers on the two sides of Jesus, they would likely have similar, again, the inscription in verse 19 that is written above Jesus' head is likely one written on their head too, of this is who the person is, their name, and then what they did, what's wrong with it, what crime they committed. And Jesus, it says on there, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews, from verse 19. I just said we didn't make it there yet, but that is the crime, that is the thing that they wanted to say, we're killing Jesus because he is the King of the Jews.
He claimed, according to them, he claimed it.
Well, yeah, and that I put this way too soon, because the next section is where this should have been under. But the point that I was going to make at this point was that even the inscription of Jesus' wrongdoing is not in fact wrongdoing. I mean, granted, if Caesar says, "Oh, this man claims to be a king, and being a king is a crime," then maybe, yeah, he was an insurrectionist. But they didn't put that. They didn't put he tried to rebel or he was an insurrection. They said this is the King of the Jews. And I have another, philosophical question, I guess, on the next section. But the point of this is Jesus is the King of the Jews. That's a true statement. And it's like they didn't even try to fabricate or even falsify some sort of actual crime that Jesus committed. He is the King of the Jews, and therefore he deserves death. I've heard it in some of the commentaries and different things that I was studying for this, was that not even in this act of crucifixion would they label Jesus a sinner. Being the King of the Jews is not a sin. Being the King of the Jews was something the Romans didn't necessarily like. But Jesus is the King. And then, obviously, the next thing I put up there, he's the King of you and me. One of the things that, again, as we will get down the list, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. Obviously, we all know that Jesus is the King of kings. He is the Lord of lords. He is the King above all nations. He's not just the King of the Jews present. He's King of every single person present. He's the King of Pilate and the Greeks and the Romans and anyone else you want to put in there. He is the King of all. But he's the King of you and me. He's the King of you and me, something like that. Anyway, in Romans, we've been studying Romans at Lions on Sunday mornings. And in Romans chapter 2, Jesus is the King of the Jews, yes, and that is great and wonderful. And I want to try to, the purpose of this was to try to engage us with the story a little bit. Jesus is the King of the Jews, and yes, he's the King of kings, he's the King of all, but he's our King. He is the King of me. He is my King. And again, if you want to think about it this way, it's like, obviously we're not necessarily knights in his service, but I mean, that's one of the relationships that I think if we put ourselves in that situation of we're supposed to protect the King. We're supposed to, if not worship the King as a human figure. If the King was a human person, you protect the King. You listen to the King. You obey the King. You do everything you can to protect the King. And yet, Romans chapter 2 and verse 29 just says, Paul making the case here, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly in circumcision of that of the heart by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from men, but from God. And so Paul's entire point there, as he continues on, he will talk about how Israel is true Israel, would be a good way of putting it, is not just someone born of the lineage of Abraham. It is someone who follows God, specifically follows Jesus. And so you and I, again, taking this maybe a step further, we are hopefully inwardly Jews. Inwardly Jew means praise. Jew means a person of praise, someone who's praising God. That's why he said at the end there, not praise from men, but praise to God. And so when we read this King of the Jews, obviously none of us are descendants, maybe specifically bodily, biologically of Abraham. But this is still our King, and this is still the death of our King. And I wanted to make that point before we moved on. The second thing I had up there very quickly, the Jews will say, shall I crucify your king, Pilate says, and they will say, we have no king but Caesar. And what a profound telling statement. What a profound telling statement, because on one hand, before Israel had a king, God was their king. And again, technically at this time, I believe that they are correct. King Herod was a king of the Jews who technically wasn't even necessarily a Jew. I think he was somehow married in. Anyways, the history there is kind of interesting. But long story short, the Jews here may make a great claim here. God is not our king. God is not the one that makes the rules for us. God is not the one that we follow. We have no king but Caesar. And so again, the philosophical question, if you will, that I had at the bottom of this one was, is this a lie of convenience? Like, hey, I really believe God is my king, but at this point I'm going to lie and say, well, no, he's not my king. You're the only king. You're the only one that I got. You're the only person that we follow, and so we'll go ahead and kill him. Or is this the shocking truth? We don't claim that God is our king. We don't claim that God is our leader. We don't claim that God has any control over us anymore. The only authority we acknowledge is Caesar.
This is the same thing they did back in Samuel's day when they said, turned their back on God's prophets and said, no, we want a king just like everybody else. You know, you're not in charge of us anymore. We want to go our own way. And they're doing it here. They're turning their back on God to go their own way.
That's exactly right. They have a history of rejecting God as their king. I mean, all the way back to Sinai, even as God approaches the people in chapter 19 of Exodus and wants to make a covenant, enter into a covenant relationship with them, and I will be your God, you will be my people, and then God later in that chapter shows up on top of the mountain, and the people are terrified. They fall down on their faces and they tell Moses, you're going up there, we're not going. And Moses said, yeah, that's what God told me. I'm going, and you are not allowed on the mountain. And then while Moses is up there, what do? They form a golden calf and say, behold, this is the God that brought you out of Egypt. I mean, they, just days before that, they were terrified of the smoke and the lightning and the fire and everything that was on top of the mountain, and the voice of God that they heard. And now they've already rejected it. This is a national pastime of the Jews of rejecting God as their king.
Well, a week ago, they hailed him as their Messiah.
Right, Jesus entered the Hosanna to the King, Hosanna to the Son of David. Less than a week previous to this is if they don't. Jesus told the Pharisees, if the people don't cry out, the rocks will cry out in their place. So, you're exactly right. So, go ahead.
Well, one of the, again, this is another thread, another line, and then there's a lot of these throughout what I've added to today's study, but again, this will also, again, become more true as we get into the next section, and just maybe hopefully hit home in a different way, but at the beginning of Jesus' life, very well, even before he was born, really, at the beginning of his life, well, what it says in Matthew chapter 2, now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, so Jesus has been born. In verse 2 of Matthew chapter 2, these are the wise men, the Magi. Matthew chapter 2, verse 2 says, where is he who is born King of the Jews? He was recognized as the King of the Jews when he was born. And at the end of his life, he is recognized as the King of the Jews as his time. So this is a thread, a theme throughout the life of Jesus and into his death. The King of the Jews is something that has, I don't know, followed him, but has described him throughout his entire life. So they're not saying anything that's untrue. Now, they're saying it mockingly, but they're not saying anything that is untrue.
Well, I think the Jews said we have no king. It was Pilate that had written on that sign. You know, and they're gonna, as Teresa kind of alluded to, the Jews are gonna fuss about his wording a little bit. We're gonna get to that, but, you know, the Jews have kind of drawn their line. It seems like the crowd that was there that day, you know, Pilate wrote his sign, King of the Jews, but the Jews are like, no king but Caesar.
And it's interesting that they claim allegiance to Caesar as their king, but Pilate doesn't afford them that. Like, he doesn't give them that privilege. He recognizes, he doesn't give them that out. This is your king, you're crucifying him. Well, no, Caesar's our king. No, he's not. You've made that clear, by the way, you've conducted yourselves today, that you would not have been happy had I spoken on Caesar's behalf. And that's what Pilate was. He was Caesar's ambassador. When Pilate spoke, he spoke with the authority of Caesar in their system. And so they would not have recognized Pilate's authority to release Jesus on Caesar's behalf, which indicates Caesar is not the king. So Pilate puts them in their place with that plaque. Verses 16 to 22. So he then handed him over to them to be crucified. They took Jesus. Go ahead.
To them, to whom? That's what I've always wondered, because they just said we can't kill him. So who's them?
I think.
Doesn't it have to be the Romans?
It says in
Well,
the second half of that verse
Yeah.
Okay.
Interesting question, and two, I think if there is anything that happens is overseen by the Romans and done with the Roman authority. So even if somehow we make this, some Jews nailed him to the cross, which I don't think happened.
No, I don't
But,
mean
yeah.
that. It just
So,
always struck me all.
So he acquiesced to them. I mean, I don't know what the wording there is, but Justin can tell us.
Well, it is essentially, there's not a whole lot that helps us. I mean, I think that it is definitely a plural form of the verb, and obviously the noun, them, and it's very generic, and there's nothing really to tie it back to.
Okay.
But, I think that essentially, one way to look at it is this is one of John's way of lumping everybody together. Obviously, the Romans have to be the ones that do this. The soldiers are obviously there, because in John 19, the very beginning, it says, Pilate took him and scourged him. The soldiers twisted together his crown of thorns, get the purple robe. And so there are soldiers there. There are soldiers present. There are soldiers in the crowd. And obviously, once we get to the place of the skull, verse 23 says, then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus. So when they, again, who the they there is the soldiers, and so the soldiers are doing the crucifying, but the Jews are also a part of the act of the crucifixion. I think John is using all of these plural forms to say everybody's involved. Everybody's in the same camp. Everybody's taking it together. Because again, it says that therefore, verse 18, therefore they crucified him. Who's the they? Obviously the soldiers are doing the crucifying, and the Jews are participating.
So in ESV, it says, finally Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. It doesn't say they took Jesus.
Verse 17, so the soldiers took charge of Jesus.
So the soldiers took charge of Jesus.
I mean, one thing for certain, it wasn't Pilate that was going to do the crucifying. So whomever he's handing it over to, he is handing Jesus over with his authority by his approval. So
There is a translation difference there. The NIV in 16 says, so Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified, so the soldiers took charge of Jesus. But the NIV is the only one that says the soldiers instead of they.
Yeah, ESV, I think Kevin was just saying, who says that, so.
Well, I've got the ESV
Oh,
here,
ESV.
and I don't know, maybe they've changed it, but this translation, the ESV says,
And updated. Well, my old trusty numeric standard here says that. Anywho, all right, so 16 to 22. Here we go. So he handed them over to them to be crucified. They took Jesus, therefore, and he went out, bearing his own cross to the place called the place of a skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 other men, one on either side, and Jesus in between. Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. It was written, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. Therefore many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. And it was written in Hebrew, Latin, and in Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews were saying to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but that he said, I am the King of the Jews. Pilate answered, what I have written, I have written.
So, yeah, these are, I intentionally had lots of philosophical questions in here last week, and then I came back in and added a couple more points at the end. But my philosophical question for this passage, this section was, what do you think was Pilate's purpose of writing the King of the Jews? Because, why, and then when he comes back, the Jews gripe again, why wouldn't he amend it? And again, we can speculate on this as, almost pure speculation. We don't know what's going on in Pilate's mind. But I put up there, would it be laziness? I mean, it's like, or laziness, and then I guess that goes into the intentional provocation of the Jews. But it's like, well, I'm going to provoke you, just rip you a good one. You guys think that, again, as Jason was saying, you guys have claimed that Caesar's your king, but you obviously don't care about Caesar, so this must be your king. Or was he trying to provoke them and saying, well, I know you would hate it if I did this? He knew the situation well enough to know that. He has obviously been a part of this situation for quite a while. Writing that would just stir the pot, as it were. And then the last thing I put up there as maybe his own defense / justification for the crucifixion, so that, in their public service of records, and the recorder there, I don't think they call it a recorder, but the recorder person is saying, well, Pilate killed Jesus, the King of the Jews. It's like, if that's in the tagline, if that's on the news that Caesar gets, so it's like, oh, okay, well, there was a reason for Pilate to kill this guy. He had a just reason, he had a just cause. Pilate's now off the hook because he had an actual insurrectionist reason to kill Jesus.
Well, I'm just thinking, he claimed, he said he didn't find any guilt in Jesus. And they're going, and he's allowed them to go through with the crucifixion. Maybe he's having some empathy and believes Jesus to be who he says he is, and he can't stop the process. So, and that's, maybe, like you said, we can just speculate, but maybe a little bit of the benefit of the doubt here, maybe.
Well, about the first time he appeared before Pilate, they got into this discussion about, talking about, if you look at chapter 18, verse 33, he asked him, he says, are you the King of the Jews? And Jesus, says, are you saying this on your own initiative, or it does tell you about me, and so on. But he goes down here, he says, Jesus tells him, my kingdom is not of this world. And Pilate says, so you are a king. So from this exchange here, I could see why he would write Jesus, the Nazarene King of the Jews. Because he asks him, are you the King of the Jews? Jesus tells him, my kingdom is not of this world. And Pilate immediately, well, so you are a king, And so I think he gets the impression here, yes, Jesus is the king. Well, he's the King of the Jews because the Jews brought him to them and all this. And I think that's probably a good indication why he would have written what he wrote.
Was it rubbing it in to call him a Nazarene?
Rubbing it in for the Jews, because
Yeah.
a good thing comes from Nazareth.
Exactly what I mean, yeah.
Well, and he asked the question in verse 9, where are you from? Jesus gave him no answer. So, I mean, I don't know, again, if Pilate says that after Jesus, the crowd says he makes himself out to be the Son of God. And so I don't know if Pilate's coming in and John is having, again, that statement. There's lots and lots of loops throughout this. But, that statement, where are you from? Well, obviously the readers of John will go, well, read John 1. Where's Jesus from? He was at the beginning. He is from, essentially, eternity, because he's from heaven. He's from God. But Jesus gave him no answer. And so, again, I don't know if Pilate didn't know his hometown and Pilate went and asked the crowd where Jesus was from. But Pilate knows, at least up until this point in the story, that Jesus is from Nazareth. And again, that would have been a slight insult, if you would, at least among the Jews, because the Jews didn't have any trouble calling him Nazarene. The Jews were like, I keep that part up there, but put in, he said he was the king of the Jews. So the next thing that I had up there is again, more of a theological / metaphorical point. But Jesus is in between these two thieves. Jesus finds himself in the middle of this crowd. He's in between two thieves, and obviously this is something that doesn't take a large imagination to follow where I'm going here. But the idea is he's in between two thieves. He's in the midst of murderers and thieves. He's in the midst of people trying to murder a just man. He's in the midst of people mobbing after him to kill him. He's in the midst of all of this crowd of people coming after him. And on one side, he has the mob. And on the other hand, there are believers there. So we'll read, there's 3 Marys. It's Mary, Mary, and Mary. And then another person. His mother's sister. So there's Mary, 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 and his mother's sister. And John is also there. And there are the 4 soldiers. And we get that from verse 23. And then, he's in the middle of all of this. He's in between a thief robber who denies him. He's in the middle of a thief robber who will believe, who will say, remember me when you come into my kingdom, in your kingdom, rather. And he's in the middle of God and man. So he is caught in the center of this entire web. He's caught in the middle of the Old and the New Testament. This is when it's going to come to a head. He's in the middle of that. He's in the middle of God and man. He's in the middle of the covenants of God. He's in the middle of essentially the universe. He's in the middle of I don't know if you want to call that time, but I mean, even our calendars, and again, this is a little bit arbitrary, but the calendars, obviously it's not necessarily the date of his death, but all of the calendars up until this point are pointing to Jesus, and everything after Jesus is pointing back to Jesus. He's in the middle of all of this. This is the center, most important event in the universe, and Jesus is right in the middle. It's all focused on him. And the focus is the universe, we'll put it this way, the Word, the power of God, the authority of God, in the middle of all of this is going to be crucified.
I mean, that's a neat point to make. I hadn't ever thought about just kind of the symmetry of all that and how it all fits together like that.
Well, and in Matthew 25, he's in the middle of the sheep that goes. Was where that was eventually getting at, but anyways.
All right, 23 to 27. Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his outer garments and made 4 parts, a part to every soldier, and also the tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece. So they said to one another, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it, to decide whose it shall be. This was to fulfill the scripture. They divided my outer garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Therefore the soldiers did these things, but standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. And Jesus then saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, and said to his mother, Woman, behold your son. And he said to the disciple, Behold your mother. In that hour the disciple took her into his own household.
So we might have to come back here. I have a lot to say about this. But the long story short of the first point is, while Jesus is dying, while the Son of God is being murdered. Obviously, these soldiers are probably the same soldiers that have crucified many people before. So this is just a normal day to them. It's just, they have become dulled to the torture and pain on the cross. Sometimes I think we can get into that category where Jesus' death is just, we talk about it so often. We take the Lord's Supper so often. We remember Jesus' death so often that we become dull to the raw emotion, the raw things that are going on when Jesus is being killed. Sometimes it just bounces off of us. Sometimes we're just in our own little world. And they're casting lots and gambling and playing games on who's going to take the last article of clothing. One of the other things that I said was a more modern day commentary. Talked about how sometimes we get like this, sometimes with our phone. Of just, we get so caught up in and entertained and caught up in our own world and being, and entertainment is something that we're constantly seeking and going for. That Jesus and our calling and what He's done for us and how we can just be so grateful to Him with our lives and with every second of our day gets shoved aside when our pursuit of entertainment. And so, I mean, just as a metaphor, I mean, sometimes it feels like to me, I'm probably the worst. I'll talk to them, go ask Nancy about that, about getting caught up in games on my phone or TV series or anything like that. But you know, we can get so focused in on our casting lots of again, it's not even close to the same thing, but gambling. But we get so focused on us and what we want to do and how fun this is that we miss what's happening behind us. So Jesus is calling us to live for Him. Jesus is calling us, again in Matthew 28, to call other people to Him. And how those two most important facts of honoring, glorifying, and worshiping God and bringing other people to Christ get shoved to the background in our effort of pleasing ourselves. And so sometimes, again, you might have, you hear how deep the Father's love for us. My voice is calling out among the scoffers. Now, you can put yourself there at the cross of Jesus. You can put yourself in the shoes of John, looking at the cross, thinking, "This is my Savior. This is my Master, the person that's been teaching me, the person that I love, my friend, the person that, again, this person that means a lot to me is being crucified." But have you ever put yourself in the shoes of one of the gamblers, one of the soldiers there? That's so disinterested in what Jesus is doing, what happened to Jesus, that they're sitting down to mess with their buddies on who's going to get the last piece of clothing. And I thought that might be an interesting perspective for us to at least think about one time.
I appreciate that. I think sometimes we've done a lot of speculating tonight of various things, Pilate's motives or Pilate's intentions, or, how the Jews reached their conclusions, or all those kind of things. And there are some aspects of speculation that sometimes I think we need to be careful with and not become dogmatic about things that we speculate about. There are other aspects of doing that kind of speculation that can be very beneficial. And I think this is one area where that everything is true, where to just read through the story and don't read it the same way that we've always read it, because we have read it so many times. We've heard the story so many times that, today I'm going to read this story, and I'm going to try, as I read the story from start to finish, I'm going to try to put myself in Pilate's shoes. From the moment Pilate enters the scene, what must he have been thinking every step along the way? What would it have been like to be him? What motivated him? And other times you read it from the perspective of one of the soldiers or one of the disciples, or Peter's perspective is different from John's perspective. Judas' perspective is different from all of them. And so read the story each time just from a different perspective and see what you can learn from it, and see how you can benefit from that perspective. And then don't forget to read it from your own perspective. And what would Jason Fish have been doing if Jason Fish was there on that day? Where would he have been in that mix? And whose side would he have been on? What would that have been like? So it's all very very cerebral, but it can be very beneficial to us. Okay, through verse 27, and I think we'll need to pick up there because you need to get through all those notes.
Yeah, there's a lot in there.
Okay, so we'll pick up with that section again next week, and there you go.
We need the young folks to hold the arms of the old folks.